In 1888, the world woke up to a shocking headline. The Merchant of Death is dead. But there was one problem. The man wasn't dead. Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite, the man whose creations reshaped war and industry, opened a newspaper and read his own obituary. It called him a killer, a merchant of destruction, a man who got rich by teaching humanity how to die faster. That single mistake, one newspaper headline, would haunt him forever. And in that haunting, Alfred Nobel made a decision that changed the course of history. From the ashes of guilt, he built one of the greatest legacies of peace and progress the world has ever known. This is the true story of the man who read his own death and rewrote it. The morning was gray, soft, and strangely quiet, as if Paris itself had paused to listen. In a small hotel room along Rue Malakoff, a single candle flickered beside an open newspaper. Its ink was still fresh, the paper trembling in the hands of a man whose name filled the headline. Le Marchand de la Mort est mort. The Merchant of Death is dead. The man was Alfred Nobel, chemist, engineer, inventor, and now, according to the press, dead. But he wasn't. It was his brother Ludwig who had died the day before. The world had made a mistake, but mistakes have power, sometimes enough to change history. For several long minutes, Alfred said nothing. The clock ticked with cruel precision, each second cutting deeper into the silence. He read the words again and again, as if trying to confirm their absurdity. The Merchant of Death is dead. Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday. He lowered the paper. His hand trembled slightly. In the candlelight, the reflection of his face shimmered in the glass. Sharp eyes, tired lines, the expression of a man who had built a life of explosions and now stared at one of his own making. That morning, in the quiet of a Paris hotel, Alfred Nobel looked death in the face and realized it was his own reputation staring back. He whispered, "This cannot be my legacy." But to understand how a man so feared became a symbol of peace and progress the world has ever known, we must return to where it began, to the frost-bitten streets of Stockholm a century earlier, where a frail, curious boy first learned the language of fire. The year was 1833. Sweden was cold, still scarred by war and poverty, but alive with invention. Inside a modest wooden house filled with metal scraps, gears, and sketches, a baby cried. Alfred Bernard Nobel, the third son of Emmanuel and Henrietta Nobel. His father was a dreamer of dangerous brilliance, an engineer who built bridges, mines, and strange mechanical contraptions that sometimes worked and sometimes collapsed spectacularly. His mother, patient and calm, ran the household like a captain steering through endless storms of debt. When creditors came knocking, she faced them with dignity. Behind her, Emmanuel would hide, scribbling notes on his next world-changing idea. From the beginning, Alfred was different. Sickly, quiet, fragile, but with a mind that burned. While other children chased snowflakes, Alfred melted them. He wanted to see how water turned to air, how heat transformed the invisible. He played with fire not for fun, but for understanding. The kitchen became his first laboratory, his mother's anxiety, his first safety measure. By 9, he was reading scientific journals meant for adults. By 10, he could speak 4 languages: Swedish, Russian, French, and English. But brilliance rarely brings comfort. His father's fortunes collapsed after a series of failed inventions, forcing the family to leave Sweden. They moved first to Finland, then to St. Petersburg, Russia, where Emmanuel found a new beginning. There, in the empire of the Tsars, Alfred's world exploded, literally and figuratively. Emmanuel had begun manufacturing underwater mines for the Russian Navy. They were crude but effective, metal shells filled with black powder, triggered by contact. Young Alfred watched in awe as his father tested them. The detonations fascinated him, not for their destruction, but for their precision, the beautiful, terrible balance of chemistry and timing. He once told his mother, "Fire, when it obeys, is the most faithful of servants." That belief became the axis of his life. Power, control, creation, and obedience, all in one spark. At 12, Alfred began formal studies in chemistry. At 16, his father sent him abroad to refine his education under the guidance of the world's top scientists. He traveled to Paris, where he studied under Professor Jules Pelouse, a name synonymous with explosive chemistry. It was in that lab that Alfred Nobel first encountered a curious liquid that would change everything: nitroglycerin. It was colorless, oily, and frighteningly unstable. A single drop could blow apart a laboratory. Most scientists refused to handle it, but not Alfred.
He looked into the shimmering yellow vial and saw not chaos, but potential. He wrote in his notebook, "If it can destroy, it can also build." That single thought would follow him like a ghost for the rest of his life. He returned to Sweden in 1863, just as Europe was transforming. The Industrial Revolution thundered across the continent. Steel replaced stone. Railways sliced through mountains. Coal-fed furnaces roared like monsters. And behind it all, the hunger for power. Faster, stronger, cheaper, never stopped. Alfred saw his moment. He began experimenting with nitroglycerin in a small shed outside Stockholm, assisted by his brothers and a handful of daring workers. He wanted to find a way to make the unstable liquid safe, to harness it for progress. But progress is never safe. In 1864, during one of his experiments, the factory exploded. The blast was heard miles away. 5 people died, including his younger brother, Emil. When Alfred arrived, the ground was still smoking. Shattered glass, twisted iron, the smell of burnt earth, and silence. He fell to his knees among the ruins. For the first time, he saw what his obsession had done. Neighbors called him a murderer. The government banned nitroglycerin within the city. But Alfred refused to stop. He rented a barge in the middle of a lake, far from anyone, and built his laboratory there. Alone, surrounded by water, he worked like a man possessed. For months he failed, until one day he noticed something. When nitroglycerin leaked into sawdust and clay, it became less volatile, stable, controllable. He had found the secret. By mixing the deadly liquid with a soft, absorbent clay called kieselguhr, he created a safe, moldable compound that could be handled and transported. He called it dynamite, from the Greek dynamis, meaning power. In 1867, he patented it, and overnight, Alfred Nobel became one of the richest men in Europe. Dynamite reshaped civilization. It carved tunnels through mountains, bridged impossible rivers, and gave birth to modern construction. But it also gave new life to war. Armies realized its potential faster than architects. With one invention, Nobel had given mankind the power to build the world or destroy it. He became a celebrity of science, a man both admired and feared. Journalists called him the king of explosives. Governments courted him. Contractors worshipped him. And yet, he was always alone, a traveler with no home, drifting between laboratories in Paris, Hamburg, and San Remo. Wealth surrounded him, but guilt lived in his pocket. He often carried a small notebook filled with thoughts not of business, but of morality. He wrote, "I am disgusted with the world. The same hand that builds civilization also digs its grave." He never married. He tried to love, briefly, through letters exchanged with a young Austrian woman named Sophie Hess. She was 23, he was 43. Their correspondence was filled with affection, wit, and melancholy. She called him "my lonely philosopher." He called her "my little Parisian bird." But his mind was restless, chained to invention. He loved humanity more than any one person, and that was perhaps his greatest tragedy. He built more factories, developed more compounds, including ballistite, the world's first smokeless gunpowder. Armies lined up to buy it. Nations fought to patent it. And Alfred Nobel became richer still, the man who had given humanity its deadliest tools. Then came the mistake that would redeem him. His brother Ludwig died in Cannes, but the French newspaper Le Figaro confused the brothers and published Alfred's obituary instead. "The merchant of death is dead." That line changed everything. He read it in disbelief, then in horror. The article didn't celebrate him, it condemned him. It called him a man who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before. For the first time, Alfred saw his life not through his own eyes, but through the world's. He had achieved everything: power, fame, wealth, yet none of it mattered if history remembered him as a monster. That night, he sat alone by candlelight, listening to the rain against the window, and made a decision that would alter the future of humanity. If he could not erase his past, he would redefine it. He opened a new notebook and wrote, "History has written my epitaph before my death. Let me now write it myself, differently." From that moment on, his obsession shifted, no longer with invention, but with redemption. He began studying philosophy, literature, and peace movements. He corresponded with the Austrian activist Bertha von Suttner, whose writings on disarmament fascinated him. She wrote about peace. He built the weapons that made peace impossible. Yet somehow they found common ground in thought, a shared dream of a world where knowledge replaced war. Years later, Bertha would win the first Nobel Peace Prize. But in 1888, neither of them could have imagined such a thing. Alfred grew older, sicker, lonelier. The wealth that once thrilled him now haunted him. He wrote to Bertha, "My factories may one day put an end to war sooner than your congresses. On the day when men can destroy each other in a second, they will finally realize the horror of it."
He traveled less, spoke little, and worked obsessively in private. One cold December night in Paris, he sat at his desk surrounded by papers. Not blueprints this time, but legal documents. He wrote his will. "All my remaining real and personal estate is hereby bequeathed to a fund, the interest on which shall be annually distributed as prizes to those who, during the preceding year, shall have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind." He listed 5 categories: physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. He hesitated before writing the last word, peace. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever written. He sealed the document, placed it in a drawer, and told no one. When Alfred Nobel died in 1896 in his villa in San Remo, Italy, the world barely noticed at first.
He was 63 years old, worn by strokes and solitude. His final words were faint but ironic. He had been prescribed nitroglycerin for his heart, the same substance that had nearly killed him so many times. To die by my own invention? Poetic, isn't it? And then he was gone. But what followed shook Europe. When his will was opened in Stockholm in 1897, the world gasped, not because of the fortune he left behind, but because of what he asked humanity to do with it. He had turned death money into life money, blood money into a promise. It was, in every sense, an act of moral rebellion against his own past. Governments were suspicious. Why would the world's greatest arms dealer suddenly want peace? Was it guilt, repentance, or genius again, but this time of the heart, not the laboratory? Newspapers speculated endlessly. Perhaps Nobel seeks to buy forgiveness, one headline read. Another sneered, even the dead can't spend their conscience. But something remarkable happened. As the legal battles over the will dragged on, the idea began to spread, the radical idea that science, literature, and peace could be rewarded, not just fought over. Ragnar Solman, his loyal assistant, carried Nobel's dream like a sacred duty. He traveled between cities and governments, arguing with bankers who called it impractical. Yet one by one signatures appeared. By 1900, the Nobel Foundation was officially born. The world waited for the first laureates. On December 10, 1901, 5 years to the day after Alfred Nobel's death, the first Nobel Prizes were awarded in Stockholm and Oslo. The moment was electric. The King of Sweden himself presided over the ceremony, though reluctantly. Many within his circle still considered Nobel a controversial figure, a man who had given civilization both dynamite and redemption. But the world saw something greater. The first Peace Prize went to Henry Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, a man who, like Nobel, had seen the horror of war and sought to heal rather than harm. It was a poetic symmetry, two men of fire and compassion meeting across time, one through death, the other through honor. For the first time in modern history, human intellect was celebrated as a moral force, not power, not politics, but progress for the sake of humanity itself. And yet, behind every triumph lies a shadow. The Nobel Prizes quickly became the most coveted awards on Earth, and inevitably, the most controversial. In the decades that followed, the world grew faster, louder, more divided. Science raced ahead, nations rose and fell, and each year as laureates stepped onto the stage in Stockholm, somewhere else in the world, an explosion, literal or political, reminded humanity of the tension between knowledge and destruction. The same paradox Alfred Nobel had lived now belonged to us all.
The 20th century arrived like thunder. Electric light illuminated cities. Engines roared across oceans and skies. The atom split, quietly, invisibly, in laboratories filled with chalk dust and caffeine. The early Nobel Prizes celebrated discoveries that defined the age. Wilhelm Röntgen for the X-ray, Marie Curie for radioactivity, Albert Einstein for the photoelectric effect. Each discovery seemed to pull humanity closer to the divine and closer to its own destruction. Energy, power, creation. The same words that had once haunted Nobel's diary now describe the very foundation of modern civilization. Einstein himself was deeply aware of the irony. He once said, "Concern for man and his fate must always form the chief interest of all technical endeavors." But few listened. By 1939, the world stood on the edge again. Science had leapt forward faster than ethics could follow. When the first chain reaction was achieved, the beginning of the atomic age, the dream of endless energy turned instantly into a weapon that could erase cities. In a sense, it was Nobel's nightmare, reborn in uranium. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated, a ghost seemed to rise from the ashes. the ghost of Alfred Nobel, watching his prophecy come true. The hand that builds civilization also digs its grave. In 1945, as the world staggered out of the ruins of war, the Nobel Committee faced a question that cut deeper than ever before. Could peace be measured in the same world that had mastered destruction? Could humanity still deserve its own prizes? They decided yes, because to stop believing in progress was to surrender to despair. And so, in the rubble of a divided world, the Nobel Prizes continued as defiant symbols of light in an age of fallout. The post-war years were a paradox of brilliance and fear. In physics, Nobel laureates explored the very particles of existence. In medicine, they decoded the human genome. In literature, poets tried to rebuild language after genocide. And in peace, the prize went to those who dared to dream beyond borders, diplomats, activists, voices in the wilderness. Each name carried its own story. Each medal bore the same inscription, for the benefit of mankind. But what did mankind mean anymore? The Cold War brought a different kind of explosion, ideological, invisible, constant. America and the Soviet Union raced not for invention, but for dominance. Satellites, missiles, espionage. Technology became the new frontier of morality. Even the Nobel Prizes reflected that tension. In 1953, George Marshall received the Peace Prize for rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan, a plan that was both humanitarian and political. In 1954, Ernest Hemingway was honored for literature that captured the despair and dignity of modern man. In 1962, a British scientist named Francis Crick stood on stage for discovering the structure of DNA, the code of life itself. The world was advancing faster than ever before, yet the same shadow followed it, the possibility of annihilation. Science had become so powerful that Nobel's original fear that progress might outrun conscience became an everyday reality. Then came 1964. A black preacher from Atlanta, Georgia, stood before the world in Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man with no weapon but his voice. He spoke of nonviolence, of dignity, of the dream that peace could be born not from treaties or governments, but from hearts. It was perhaps the purest embodiment of Nobel's hope, that human progress was not only measured in invention, but in compassion. King's speech echoed far beyond the hall that day. He said, "I accept this award on behalf of all men who love peace and brotherhood." And somewhere, if spirits listen, Alfred Nobel's might have nodded in solemn agreement. But history never stays peaceful for long. The late 20th century brought new crises: Vietnam, the Cold War, dictatorships, terrorism, and the rise of weapons so advanced that the word apocalypse no longer felt biblical. Still, each year, the Nobel Committee continued to seek those who built instead of destroyed. In 1979, Mother Teresa received the Peace Prize for her life among the poor of Calcutta. When asked what the award meant to her, she said softly, "It means nothing. What matters is the love we give." The hall fell silent. It was a moment that transcended politics, the kind of moral simplicity Nobel himself had searched for, but never found. By the end of the 20th century, the Nobel Prizes had become the closest thing humanity had to a moral compass. But with fame came controversy. Every choice was questioned, every omission politicized. The prize for peace, in particular, became a battlefield of ideas, sometimes awarded to the deserving, sometimes to the divisive. Yet, through it all, the spirit of Nobel's will endured, to reward those who conferred the greatest benefit to humankind.
And still, the paradox lingered. For every discovery that cured a disease, another built a weapon. For every breakthrough in physics, a new crisis in ethics followed. It was as if the world had inherited Alfred Nobel's conscience, restless, brilliant, guilty, and eternally hopeful.
A century after his death, Alfred Nobel's name meant something entirely different than it had in that mistaken obituary. No longer the merchant of death, now simply the man who gave us the Nobel Prize. And yet, the irony remains. The foundations of the prizes, the money that sustains them, came from the profits of dynamite, from the earth torn open by explosions, from the same chemistry that changed warfare forever. The world honors peace with the tools of destruction. Perhaps that too is part of the human story, to redeem what we cannot erase. Each December, in the glow of chandeliers in Stockholm and Oslo, laureates stand on the same stage. They bow, they receive the medal bearing Nobel's face, and they hear the applause of nations. But somewhere in that applause, if you listen carefully, there is a whisper, a reminder that progress and peril share the same heartbeat. Because every invention begins with curiosity and ends with responsibility. Every act of creation carries the seed of destruction, and every man who plays with fire must, in the end, decide what to do with the flame. The story of Alfred Nobel is not just the story of one man's transformation. It is the story of civilization itself. How guilt can become grace, how destruction can lead to peace, and how even the darkest legacy can light the way forward. He was a man who read his own death and chose to rewrite it. And in doing so, he gave us something far greater than dynamite. He gave us a reason to believe that science and conscience can coexist, that humanity, despite all its flaws, still has the capacity to redeem itself. Every time the world honors a discovery, every time a writer, a scientist, a doctor, or a peacekeeper stands beneath the light of the Nobel ceremony, it is not just an award. It is a conversation across time between the man who once created explosions and the world that learned to build with them. Alfred Nobel's fire never died. It changed form. It became the light of knowledge. And maybe, just maybe, that is what he wanted all along.